Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. I gotta say thanks to all of you that are watching on a regular basis. I've gotten a ton of really good feedback. I've gotten a lot of people leaving comments stating that they're utilizing some of the things they've learned on the channel to catch more fish. And that's what this channel is all about, guys. We're trying to share information to help each and every one of us learn and catch more fish when you're out on the water. And today's topic is based off of one of those questions that I've gotten from a subscriber who wants to know what baits they should be fishing around rock that are relatively snag free. You know they need to be fishing the bottom because the fish are holding on the bottom, and they're a bank angler, so they want something that won't get stuck nearly as much as some of the other baits. So I've got a handful of baits here that I really think excel at not only catching fish off rocky banks, but also are relatively snag free. Now, the obvious answer here is to use something that's not on the bottom, but in the question, they stated that they get more bites when fishing the bottom. So I want to talk about bottom baits. And, no matter what you're doing, anytime you're fishing around rock, you're going to end up getting snagged at some point. But in the case of this individual, they don't want to be breaking off left and right because that gets expensive. And at the same time, when you're fishing from shore, you don't even have the ability sometimes to go try to retrieve that bait. So in no particular order, I've got 5 baits here that I utilize a ton, and I've got some little nuggets of information about each one that may help you prevent yourself from getting snagged more when using it. So the first bait I want to talk about is a pretty classic bait when it comes to fishing rock, and that's a football head jig. This is just a Dirty Jigs football head with a Berkley power bait, meaty chunk on the back. This is a great bait for fishing around rocks. But I know a lot of you will say, well, if I'm fishing a football head, I'm probably going to get stuck a lot. My tip with a football head jig is to always try to get away with the lightest weight possible. I think for whatever reason, a lot of times we talk about football head jigs and the standard weight is like 3/4 ounce to 1 ounce. And that's true when fishing ledges and way offshore, but there is a ton of times to use a 1/4 ounce or a 3/8 ounce jig. And that's really for a shore angler, since you're working uphill, the lighter the bait, the better. So I would start with a lighter weight and work the bait slower and try to maximize bites from that standpoint. If you're having trouble staying on the bottom, go with a slightly heavier size. But a football head jig is an outstanding bait for fishing around rocks and is relatively weedless when you consider the fact that you're dragging something through rock cracks the entire way back to the boat or the shore, depending on where you're fishing. So you gotta have a football head jig, but you want to start with a lighter weight. Don't necessarily think you got to throw a 3/4 ounce or a 1 ounce bait. The next is just a exposed hook swim bait. In this case, this is a hollow belly on a Dirty Jig swim bait hook. A swim bait is an extremely versatile bait that you can use pretty much everywhere. But if you're just fishing on rocks, you throw it out, let it hit the bottom, and slowly reel it up. Every 10 or 15 cranks of the handle, I usually let the bait fall back to the bottom, reel it back up. And because of the shape of it and the size of it, it's a pretty weedless bait when fishing rocks. There are times you could potentially get stuck. If you're fishing this where you're casting it way out, I would definitely want to try to find a bait that's got a line tie that's more of that 30-degree angle versus a 90-degree, because the 90-degree, when it hits bottom, will want to roll up, and that's when you get a lot of your snags. With a 30-degree, that's going to hit a rock, and the line tie is just going to pull it up and over and make it a lot more weedless or snag resistant. So, this is a really good bait for fishing around rocks, and it's a really good bait as well for fishing from shore. And I would say the same thing with that. Start with a lighter weight and then work your way up. If you're having trouble keeping it on the bottom, go with a slightly heavier weight. The next bait is a Nemo Rig. In this case, again, you guys, I've talked about a Nemo Rig a lot. It's just your favorite stick bait with a nail inserted in the head. So when this bait falls, it falls like that, and it basically stands up on the bottom. And what that does is it keeps the hook away from, you know, the rocks or the snags on the bottom, and it's a pretty weedless bait. So I would highly recommend having this. It's a great bait for fishing around rocks. It generates a ton of strikes, whether you're in a boat or from shore. It catches a lot of fish of all different sizes. So I would recommend a Nemo Rig. If you really want to make it more weedless, you can get a weedless hook on it, or rig it weedless, which would then be similar to a chicken rig. Either way, it's a great bait for fishing around rocks. You find that the worm doesn't usually fall down inside the rock crevices. It'll hit and stand up on top of a rock, which is really good for fishing around that. The next up, anytime you're fishing around rocks, you definitely want to consider a crankbait. Crankbaits are an absolute must, a really good bait for covering water, and it generates a lot of strikes off rock because when the bait is, you know, wobbling, it's deflecting off rocks, creating that erratic motion, which generates a lot of strikes. And in this case, the tip with selecting a crankbait would be to select a crankbait that's got a wide wobble and sharp hooks. The wider the wobble means that bait is really going to deflect off the rocks more versus settle into a crack and get stuck. In this case, this is a Berkley digger. This is the 10.5 size. It's a really erratic motion, really wobbles really well, a nice wide wobbling bait. And generally, that's going to prevent you from getting stuck more than a tight wobbling crankbait, because a tight wobbling crankbait, when it hits something, won't want to deflect off. It'll just kind of want to bury into that crack in between the rocks. So you'll get stuck more with a tight wobbling bait versus a wide wobbling crankbait. And again, I would recommend trying to match the depth with the depth of your crankbait. So if you have a crankbait that runs super deep, it's going to really bang into the rocks a lot harder and probably get stuck more than a bait that runs at roughly the same depth that those rocks are at. So try to match the diving abilities of your crankbait with the depth that you're fishing. The last choice, and a super good bait to use around rocks, and one that's really very much snag resistant, is a Carolina rig. And you know, you guys, I did a video recently on how when I Carolina rig, I'm throwing the Lindy no snag weight versus a typical egg sinker. But even with the egg sinker, that's a relatively weedless presentation, because you know what happens when you've got your Carolina rig, you know, your line is at a pretty good horizontal line to the bottom, right? So it's parallel to the bottom. So when you're dragging it, you've got a large weight that's not able to settle into a lot of those cracks because your line is coming out both sides, and it's almost acting as a little bit of a safety net to prevent that weight from really settling down inside the cracks. Now again, like the football head jig, you don't want to be throwing a 1 ounce weight if you're fishing 10 feet of water. You're gonna get stuck regardless if you do that. But if you can throw a lighter Carolina rig, you know, regardless of the weight that you choose, you know, in my opinion, if you really don't want to get stuck, the Lindy no snag is a much better choice than a normal egg sinker. But you just want to throw a weight that is, you know, gonna be heavy enough to keep you on the bottom, but not heavy enough to get stuck consistently. You know, from a bait choice, you know, I like a creature bait style. This is the Power Hog. If you like, you know, the Zoom Brush Hog is a good creature style bait. You know, I think a bigger, bulkier bait helps keep the weight off the bottom a little bit. Well, I mean, not when I say off the bottom, it just doesn't settle in quite as well. If you have more plastic holding it back, you've got a little bit more resistance on the weight. So I like big creature baits when I'm throwing a Carolina rig, but regardless, it's the weight really that comes down or comes into play when you're trying to prevent the bait from getting stuck. So go with a little bit lighter Carolina rig weight, but it's a great bait for fishing around rock, generates a ton of bites. So guys, I hope that was helpful. Those are 5 baits that I utilize around rock that, you know, keep me on the bottom but don't, you know, keep me from getting caught and snagged a lot more than some of the other choices that were out there. Give them a try, whether you're fishing from a boat or whether you're fishing from shore. I think you'll find that they do keep you from getting snagged on a consistent basis. So thanks for watching, guys. If the video was helpful, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, share it on your social media pages, and stay tuned for new tips and tricks that come out every day.